Hey everybody, what's up? Sorry I missed you guys last week. I was out sick, so if I start hacking or coughing here, don't call the ambulance. It's just me clearing some stuff out. We are in Daniel still because I like when we do these and I did the first chapter and the second chapter and I read the third chapter. I said, yeah, we're sticking around. So if you remember last chapter, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream that no one could interpret. And all these fake wise men were trying to interpret it, and none of them could, except for Daniel. And Daniel explains the king's dream, and he has this dream of a statue, and Nebuchadnezzar sees a statue with layers of different, like metal and stone, and Daniel explains that these layers are actually kingdoms that are going to be coming, and that every one of these kingdoms is going to pass away. But God, the king above all kings, is actually going to get rid of all these kingdoms with a rock pulled out of the mountain. And he is going to establish a permanent and unmoving kingdom in the place of all these temporary kingdoms of the world. Right? We know. If you've been around for history, if you just look outside, things change. Things change in our lives all the time. Things are always changing, moving. What people thought yesterday is not what they're going to think tomorrow. Things change. But Daniel said, God has a plan to set up a kingdom that doesn't shift or change, and if you trust in him, he is powerful and in control over all kingdoms and in all times. And Nebuchadnezzar, in this dream, his kingdom, Babylon, was a golden head. And Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, yeah, that's cool. And he says, oh, yeah, your God seems really cool, and I'll listen to that, and I'll worship him, all these lip service ideas that King Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel, that he is going to listen to what Daniel has to say about God being the king over the whole earth, and all kingdoms being under him. And we get into chapter 3, and we say that even though Nebuchadnezzar said that, he might not really get it. Even though Nebuchadnezzar says that he understands that God is in control and king over all the earth, he doesn't act like it. In fact, we see what Nebuchadnezzar is stuck on is himself, his kingdom as the golden head. So, Daniel chapter 3, here we go. Some exciting stuff. We'll get into it more as I read. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. So like a big statue, like almost like 10 stories high. And he set it up in the plain in Dura in the province of Babylon. And then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for all of his, I'm not going to read all the words, all of his important officials, all the bigwigs. And they were to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So all the bigwigs assembled for the dedication of the statue, and when they were standing before the statue, Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed, "You are commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be immediately thrown into a blazing fire." And therefore, as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and the entire musical ensemble, all the peoples and nations and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You see the issue? God says to Nebuchadnezzar in his dream, that Daniel interprets for him, excuse me, I am king over all the nations, over all the world, and you are a temporary kingdom, a great kingdom, a king over kings, but I am the king over the whole earth. Excuse me, guys. I warned you. Fun time. And Nebuchadnezzar says that he gets it, but he doesn't actually follow through. To Nebuchadnezzar, he and what he wants, and he is still the number one most important thing in the entire world. Nebuchadnezzar is a self-centered, selfish, prideful, delusional king. And he thinks that he is going to be above everyone else. And he makes everyone else bow down to him. He builds this giant gold statue to show his power. You go, wow, this guy doesn't get it. But what we need to understand is that Daniel is not just speaking to this guy in Babylon a really long time ago. Daniel is speaking to us now. Remember, we said that we are like the Jews in Babylon, and the world around us is like Babylon. The world around us right now thinks it is the hottest thing that has ever happened. That it is so enlightened and so cool, and knows that everything is going on, and it's never going to change, and we're always going to be in power, and everyone's always going to look back and see how cool and awesome we are. When in reality, ever since humanity has been existing, we've been taking steps forward and looking back and down on those who came before us. And every kingdom falls, and every kingdom fades, and every person, no matter how great their successes are, there will be those who come along who have more successes, and they are lost to time. That's the way life works. But King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't get that. He thinks that he is the one in charge. So instead of serving the one who is actually in control, he builds a statue to show his own power and makes everyone worship him. But there's a twist. Listen up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Babylonians came forward. Certain people in the king's court came forward and denounced the Jewish people. And they said, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound must bow down to the statue or be thrown into the furnace. But there are certain Jews who you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, and their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they pay no heed to you, O king, and they do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." So Daniel's not in this story, but it's the story about these three other guys. And Daniel is absent, probably because he's actually already in like the king's court, so he didn't have to show up to this thing. But there's these guys who are serving Nebuchadnezzar and rules as as officials, government officials. And they show up and they see this for what it is, that it's a farce. They will not bow down and worship this statue because they know that Nebuchadnezzar is not the king over all kings. That Nebuchadnezzar is not in control of all nations, that God is. And they are unwilling to do that. And these people come and they have something against the Jewish people. They have something that the Jewish people are doing that they don't like. They have something against them. Just like many people have something against Christianity and what it shares today. They have something against the truth that God is in control and the people that are following that faithfully, and they are trying to get them killed. I don't think anybody's ever tried to get you killed, but there are many places in the world today where people have such an issue with the Christian message of truth that they are trying to be killed by the people around them. And even in the United States, there are people who are embracing the spirit of the modern age, thinking that we all have it figured out, who don't want to hear Christians say a word, that don't want to hear what God's plan for their life is, that don't want to hear that God is in control of everything and that we have to serve and follow him. And we see it here in Daniel. So for you and me, we shouldn't be surprised when people come against us, but look up what happens. Listen, because these humble, like from their perspective, weak followers of God are going to come against the number one superpower of that anyone knew of in that area at that time, Babylon, and they are going to, not rudely, not because they're mean, but they're going to challenge the claim that Nebuchadnezzar is in control. Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods, nor do you worship the golden statue that I have set up? You should hear the music and fall down and worship the statue that I have made. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? King Nebuchadnezzar says, I am more powerful than God, and you're in my hands now. You're not in God's. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have something to say about that. They have something to say about this idea of how powerful Nebuchadnezzar thinks he is. Listen up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to prevent a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, whom we serve is able to deliver us. We're not in your hands, we're in God's hand. And he can deliver us out of your hand, O king. Let him deliver us. But even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Hey, Nebuchadnezzar, we're not in your hand, we're in God's hand. And we hope that he saved us, but even if we're not, we're still in God's hand, and we're still faithful to him, because we know that he is in control. Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage that he ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more. That's sort of a hyperbole. It's a weird cultural thing. He told him to make it get hotter. And he ordered some of his strongest guards in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them in the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics and their trousers and their hats and their other garments, and they were throwing into the furnace of blazing fire, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was so overheated that raging flames killed the man who threw them in. But then the king was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to the counselors, Was it not 3 men that we threw and bound and tossed in the fire? They answered the king, O true king, he replied, but I see 4 men, unbound and walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god. And Nebuchadnezzar approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and all of the government officials and the king's counselors gathered together saw that the fire had no power over the bodies of these men, and not even a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothes were not harmed, and not even the smell of smoke came off of them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and delivered his servants who trusted him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies, rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people or language that others blaspheme against their God shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to save in this way. And then the king promoted those 3 to the province of Babylon. Just like at the end of the last story, the king sort of turns around and looks like, oh yeah, this god's awesome. This god's really powerful. And we see that the king responds to God's power in the way that he would hope others respond to his power. He says, if anyone is disloyal, right? If anyone's rebellious against this God, I will do to them what someone would do if they were rebellious against me. Essentially cut them up and burn their house down. And we go, oof, this is not a good guy. We start to see this with this king. We already knew this, but we get to see that Nebuchadnezzar is kind of rough. And this is maybe really not what God wants from Nebuchadnezzar. And just like last time, when Nebuchadnezzar worships God, he acknowledges God's strength and power, but it's probably not going to sink too deep. So next week, we're going to see like the final standoff between God and Nebuchadnezzar, between the powers of Babylon and the powers of the God of Israel. And it's going to be pretty epic. But for right now, I want you to think about what are some things that the world around you, I don't know, in your school, in your life, in your day-to-day, that people want you to bow down and accept. Things that you know maybe are wrong, things that you know maybe God stands against, ideas that people are like, well, everyone agrees on this. This is the modern way. Like, we figured it out. We're so smart and enlightened, and we know. We know this. And you should just accept it. Because you don't want to follow that God, right? You don't want to follow a God who'd say this or that. You want to follow a God who isn't as accepting of me as I am. You don't want to follow a God who is limiting to you. You don't want to follow a God who tells you that you cannot do all of these different things that you feel you need to be a fulfilled person. You don't want to follow a God who tells you that you're not in control. But we know the reality is that we aren't. That we are in God's hands. And that He is the one who's ultimately in control. And we can either live against that reality and face the consequences, or we can either live confident in that reality and face life with confidence or surety, with knowing where we stand with the one who's ultimately in charge. All right, thanks, guys. I know this is a little long, so I hope it'll fit up on Instagram. Have a good night.